Hey, Chapter 8, AP Environmental Science, Community Ecology, good stuff. We're going to talk niches in here, things like keystone species, foundation species, real important stuff to the AP exam at the end. So let's dive into this. First of all, a biological community, biological meaning living, so biological community meaning all the living parts of a community. First of all, its physical appearance. That could be the size of the forest, the size of the field, the size of the canopy in the tropical rainforest, the size of the desert. Stratification is layers, just like ogres have layers, forests have layers, rainforests particularly, as I mentioned before, have layers. The canopy is where most of the life is, which is on top. Distribution of species, most of them, of course, if you look at that picture below, most of them are not going to live in the field. They're going to live in the protection of the forest, particularly things like deer, and where the food is, of course, too. Large communities tend to be patchy. They tend to follow the pattern of obviously where the habitat is. So if there's a great amount of forest in one region, that's where a lot of creatures are going to live, and maybe next to it, like the field, as I mentioned, not so much. Transition does occur at the edges. That is called an ecotone. Very important word. Ecotone is where that forest meets the field in this case, or it is where the desert meets the mountain, whatever the case may be, ecotone. Increased edge may be harmful due to fragmentation. More vulnerable fragmentation is when you partially cut down a forest. More on that one in history. Biological community, species diversity. Different species is what's called species richness. So the number of different species in a community is how rich it is. So Wisconsin, incredibly rich. We've got skunks, we've got possum, we've got deer, we've got bats, we've got little bugs, we've got big bugs, a lot of different things. Abundance of individuals within each species is its evenness. So we have a lot of deer in Wisconsin. So the species evenness for deer is very high. Niche structure, number of niches, there's similarities, differences, interaction of species with each other. Again, in Wisconsin, because of our temperate deciduous, we have a large number of niche structures and therefore a lot of plants and animals. High richness tends to correlate with low even species evenness. What that means is the more rich an environment, so the more number of species, let's say there's 1,000 different species in Brookfield, which there may be, well then the number of one type of species is probably low. Most species-rich environments know these in order: rainforest, coral reefs, deep sea, and large tropical lakes. Those are very high species. Factors affecting species diversity, first of all, as we get away from the equatorial region, latitude on terrestrial, meaning the land. From the equator, it's highest in the tropics. I've said this 1,000 times already, and it declines toward the poles. Pollution is a huge factor, particularly in aquatic regions. Another very major limiting factor in aquatics is dissolved oxygen. But if you have pollution, you're not going to have very many species. Theory of island biogeography. I wish I would have discovered this. You can see a beautiful picture of the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos are right there. Oh, look, I just figured out how to use the arrow on this thing. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, which is right here. That is where Darwin did most of his studies. So you can see the islands right here. Theory of island biogeography. Where will the most species end up? Now, what happened is we know species traveled from here over to the Galapagos Islands at one time. That was proven by Darwin's finches. So where would they end up? Now let's think about that. They're just like humans. They tend to be a little lazy. They're going to end up at the closest island, and they're going to end up at the biggest. Why are they going to end up at the biggest? Well, because there's the most resources. There's the most niches. There's the most habitat. That is the theory of geography. Just a little chart that shows this. As immigration gets lower and lower and lower, so we see the rate of immigration or extinction is what this chart is showing. So we've got very high immigration up here. Extinction tends to be very low because species are moving out of an area probably to set up shop in another region, thus the theory of island biogeography, so they live longer. But as immigration gets lower, what happens is extinction rate tends to get higher. As species stay in one area and tend to compete against each other, some are going to be outcompeted and become extinct. So, theory of island biogeography, or also known as the species equilibrium model. Remember, equilibrium means everything kind of stays the same. Island species determined by how fast a new species arrives and how fast old species become extinct. Remember, that's a formula we looked at before. So the number of species in a region is how many come in, aka immigrate, versus those that become extinct. If a lot come in and a lot do not become extinct, we're going to have a lot of competition. Eventually, some are going to have to become extinct or move. Immigration, of course, as I said, is affected by two things: size of the island and distance from the mainland. The model is also used to describe habitat islands in protected areas like national parks. So what happens in national parks is we tend to have little islands within of habitat that is very good, where people can't go, and animals can move from one of those islands to another, even within a setting. Niches, those animals that are native to a region, those whose original home is in the ecosystem. In Wisconsin, white-tailed deer is a great example of something that is native to Wisconsin. Non-native or invasive, we have a huge problem with these, or alien, evolved in a different ecosystem and migrated. The great classic example, many of them in Wisconsin, the zebra mussel, the quagga mussel, the earthworm, believe it or not, was brought over from Europe at one time. That is not native to this region. The Asian beetle, which has pushed out our normal beetles, because it's taken over in habitat. It's very aggressive. It's an R-selected species, it's called. The technical definition of being non-native is a species that has moved in within the last, ready for this, 200 years. Indicator species, they alert our environment to changes. Birds, amphibians, they are very high in vulnerability. Amphibians in general, like frogs, which need to spend part of their life in the water and part of their life out of the water, particularly laying eggs in the water. What happens is if they start dying at a phenomenal rate, something's wrong with our environment. That is duly noted by population biologists. Birds, if you find a bunch of birds dead, something's massively wrong with the environment, because the reality is birds, if something's bad like pollution, they can get up and move. If they're dying, woo. So why are amphibians declining? A little case study. Habitat loss, fragmentation. In other words, we're breaking up where they live. We're draining swamps. Bad. Drought, pollution, increase in UV radiation. Overhunting, increase of parasitism, introduction of non-native species, they push that. Why do we really care if indicator species disappear? Well, first of all, they suggest the environmental quality is declining. If a bunch of species that are deemed indicators start dying, something is wrong. They play ecological role. Those little frogs eat lots of mosquitoes in the state of Wisconsin. So if they're gone, our mosquito population goes up, and then our West Nile virus goes up. Possible medicines too. As I mentioned before, maybe we get something from these animals that, quite honestly, we can use. And lastly, something called a keystone species. Keystone is a species that is very important to our environment. It has a large effect on other organisms. Bees are an example. They help pollinate. Bats are an example. They help pollinate. Sometimes they're top predators. The reason top predators are deemed keystone species is because they keep the rest of the animals below them in a food chain in check. Loss can result in far-reaching ramifications. So bees in Wisconsin, we know, are on the decline. Maybe it's from pesticides, maybe it's from genetically modified organisms. We have no idea right now. But we have to bring bees in from Illinois, and we hate to rely on Illinois, but we have to every year in order to maintain our bee population and to pollinate our corn and our potatoes and other plants like strawberries that we really like. Foundation species, like an elephant. Think of an elephant. Enhance an environment. You never want to mess around with a bunch of elephants that are storming towards you. Elephants, when they storm, get mad as a group, will uproot trees in the savanna. What that actually does is kind of a good thing. It actually allows for other plants to grow. Zebra mussels are thought of maybe as a foundation species around here. They are terrible, as we'll talk about in class more, but the reality is what they do is they clean up an ecosystem. So with all those zebra mussels in a very polluted area like Pewaukee Lake, maybe it's cleaning it up, and maybe it'll make it a very clear lake. That's it for 8, part 1. We'll continue on with part 2 soon.